Alright, let's see if I can make this one quick. Rebel Moon sucks. Like, seriously, it is one of the worst films I've ever had the displeasure of watching, and it might just be the worst film of the year. Certainly worse than anything put out by the MCU this year, and that's saying a lot. Like, seriously, if your multi-million-dollar film is somehow poorer quality than this, I think you need to find a new line of work. Speaking of which, let me give you one more little statement to put into context how bad this lukewarm coffee cup of a movie is. This film was actually supposed to be a Star Wars film, but the reason the movie was never picked up by Disney was because Disney didn't want it. Keep in mind, Disney saw this and thought it was totally fine. So yeah, I think it's time to get to why. But before we do that, I'm going to bring up another relatively recent sci-fi movie that you may have heard of, that also just so happens to be the first part of a complete story just like Rebel Moon. I'm talking about Dune, of course. Now let's take one little scene from Dune and show how it develops the characters in it.
Don't stand with your back to the door. How many times do we have to tell you?
This line, along with what Paul is currently doing, communicates numerous things to the audience about the relationship between these two characters. You don't even need to know the name of the voice that's currently off screen or what he looks like, but you already know what kind of guy he is. He's kind of a stickler and he's not very patient with Paul. Meanwhile, Paul is more focused on hitting the bag at the moment, caring more about that than a more menial habit that would be more likely to save his life. This shows how headstrong and cocky he can be, which is supported by previous scenes as well as the line which we are about to hear.
I can tell it was you by your footsteps, Gurney Halleck.
Someone might imitate my stride.
We've now learned the other character's name in the scene is Gurney, and the information was communicated in a way that made sense. Paul's identifying Gurney by the sound of his footsteps in a sort of playful manner, which as we are about to see is something that Gurney does not appreciate all that much at the moment. It's also a great setup for a scene later in the film.
Choose your blade.
I've had quite a day, Gurney. Give us a song instead. That's rude.
Gurney ain't having any of that. At this point in the story, Gurney believes that it's imperative that Paul is ready for anything, and Paul is obviously not used to Gurney's approach. Given how impatient Gurney has been up to this point, the fact that he's smiling here could be showing that he really doesn't think Paul's that much of a challenge. And sure enough, after just a little bit of back and forth, Gurney bests Paul. Paul is frustrated with this outcome. Rather than accepting accountability for how he's fighting, he just says he's feeling off.
Guess I'm not in the mood today.
Mood? What's mood to do with it? You fight when the necessity arises, no matter the mood. Now fight!
Paul is probably being truthful, but either way, Gurney acts disgusted and starts fighting in a much more aggressive way. This forces Paul to be quick on his feet and resourceful. After getting disarmed, Paul darts over to the weapons table and grabs dual knives. Rather than continuing to go head-on, like he initially did, Paul sweeps Gurney off his feet and wins. Sort of.
But look down, my lord. You're to join me in death. I see you found the mood.
Gurney looks satisfied after all this, as he has brought out the best in Paul. However, as soon as Paul asks about how bad their upcoming fight with the Harkonnens will be, Gurney's attitude takes a complete 180.
Your eyes, I need to see it in your eyes. You never met Harkonnens before. I have. They're not human, they're brutal!
Gurney's unique anger towards the Harkonnens indicates a more personal history with them, something that's probably going to be taken from the book and elaborated on in part 2. But at the moment, it's still open to interpretation. Gurney then holds Paul's head for a moment, showing that his frustration and anger truly comes from a place of love and concern. All in all, it's a fantastic scene from a fantastic movie, and I recommend checking out Dune because there's so much good stuff in it like this. Anyways, let's check out a scene from Rebel Moon. These two characters here are on their way looking for warriors that can help defend their planet from a giant, planet-destroying empire. How would a small farming community be able to stop an empire that big and powerful with only a handful of extra people, you ask?
Don't know!
However, I'll try to put the stupid world building to the side for a second and focus on the characters. So character A asks a couple of questions about character B's background.
Fighting for the realm?
You could say that.
I mean, are you wanted for desertion?
That and more.
Notice there was no effort put in whatsoever to try to weave this information into the conversation. It's just ask question, get answer, and it's almost entirely for the audience. Also, this information doesn't seem very necessary. If character B is a deserter, then based on everything we've been told up to this point, I don't see the need to set this up. Instead, you should be using this time to make the characters more relatable and flesh out the relationships between them, because hardly any of these characters in this shitty movie have any human aspects to them. Anyways, character B proceeds to ask a question like she's an NPC from a Bethesda game.
Anything else you want to ask me?
And then character A asks, why would an evil empire bother destroying a bunch of farmers?
But we're just farmers. We're not a threat. How can you know they will destroy us?
Psst. By the way, the reason in the movie is because they're really evil. And that takes us into a flashback. Basically, she got abducted as a child because some Lords of Arabia motherfucker saw something in her. She becomes a really high-ranking member, and then she fought in the army, where she loses her boyfriend on the battlefield. By the way, the evil empire in this universe thinks that it's a good idea to encourage its soldiers to fall in love with each other, because that totally wouldn't backfire and cause soldiers to become more dedicated to their well-being of their partners than the state. Like seriously. Even in the real world, we have cases of soldiers killing their officers because they were just tired of their bullshit. Giving soldiers an increased concern for the well-beings of each other just gives them more individuality, and Zack Snyder should be ashamed for ever thinking that this was a good world-building idea. Anyways, that's pretty much the entire flashback. And honestly, it hardly even feels like I'm learning anything about this character despite knowing her entire past, and more like someone just read me the first 3 paragraphs of a Wikipedia article out loud. Outside of simply being kinda quiet, this character never really shows any signs of trauma or any interesting behavior that could result from what we learn in this flashback. Going back to the example of the scene in Dune, Gurney and Paul are both made relatable. In this scene, you see frustration, playfulness, joy, and blatant rage from either of them. While this is happening, you're watching these characters converse naturally. You're still learning things about what their place is and what their backstories are. It's not said outright why Gurney hates the Harkonnens so passionately in the movie, but there is certainly the implication that the cruelty of the Harkonnens, one way or another, is at least part of the reason why Gurney is so callous compared to another swordsman like Duncan Idaho, who is also a skilled fighter but is much less subdued than Gurney. His attitude also indicates that he's a seasoned veteran, and the way he cares about Paul is hinting at what is later clear to be loyalty to Paul's entire family. It's a funny thing, really. Both of these characters are clearly people who have grown callous because of the horrific experiences with the antagonistic faction in the story. But one film has to give you a shitty 5-minute flashback showing everything without giving the character any sort of relatability whatsoever. The scene in Dune only needs a few lines and a good delivery in order to communicate the same thing, while still setting the stakes of the plot and giving us a relatable human character. Anyways, that's all I've got. I have nothing left to say about this stupid excuse for a movie other than Zack Snyder shouldn't be allowed to so much as think about writing a script, holding a camera, or drawing a comic book.
I gotta testify, come up in the spot looking extra fly. For the day I die, I'ma touch the sky.